My name's David Hoang. I am a director of product design at Webflow and also a design partner at On Deck, as you know.
Great, thank you. And could you tell me a bit about your disability or disabilities?
Yeah, maybe the one I can talk about is diagnosed and something I've struggled with my entire life. And then maybe I could talk about the other thing because it's not quite diagnosed, but it's something I know you and I have talked about neurodiversity too, and maybe just want to talk about some general challenges in that regard. But just want to say I'm not diagnosed in that way. But the first one is I'm colorblind. So I think as a designer, as you can imagine, the first thing people always ask you, even when they mean it as a joke or just to be playful, is like, how can you be a designer if you're colorblind, right? Color is such an important part of what we do as designers. How could a colorblind person be in design? And the undiagnosed one that I wanted to share about is because I thought it was just something that was a personal struggle I had in my life, and it's something I'm starting to uncover a little bit more as I really understand neurodiversity and really learning a little bit more about that field. That's still very new to me, but uh, I often describe myself as a very visual learner, and I get really overwhelmed by giant documents and a lot of structure around things. And you can imagine for a design leader or just a leader in general, is you're supposed to be organized, you're supposed to be concise. And for me, it's hard for me to remember things. It's hard for me to connect the dots. And I need to take a lot of visual notes and have a lot of reminders for myself to do that. So I guess in the myth of being a designer and a leader, those are kind of two things that you often don't think about, being a colorblind designer and then also really struggling with retaining memory, retaining things and remembering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing all that with me. I can certainly relate to the second half of that.
Yeah.
Having to take visual notes and being less than structured is a nice way of putting it. So can you tell me, when did you discover your disabilities?
Yeah, I learned I was colorblind pretty early when I was a kid. So I would say I was like 9 or 10 years old when I found out I was colorblind. Because for some reason, as a kid, I don't even know why I wanted to do this growing up, but was always fascinated with aviation and remember telling myself oh, I would love to learn to fly or even go in the Air Force or something, just as a kid does. Finding out if you're colorblind, you're disqualified, right? At least that was the rule at the time. I think it still is. And just really understanding, that's the first time I felt disabled in
Mm.
that way. And I think growing up, disabilities, I thought of it as physical disability. So being able to kind of understand, or at least more physically apparent disabilities than being colorblind. So it was the first time I uh, felt like having a disability. And as a kid, I didn't really know what to think of it, right? And then again, as I mentioned, I always remember um, just being colorblind, being and studying a lot of art classes. It was really hard to navigate that and just remember conversations with colleagues about yeah, how can you be an artist if you're colorblind, and going through some of those challenges.
Yeah, did you have to take an art theory class or a color theory class, I mean?
I did, and I think the famous thing is just in color theory books or in health classes when they do the I forget the term for it, but it's like the color dots, and you're supposed to be able to visually see something in there, and just remembering I don't see anything, everything looks the same in that regard. So yeah, color theory was something where it was definitely a struggle for me, if you can imagine.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't imagine how to get through that class.
Yeah.
I don't, have you ever seen Little Miss Sunshine?
Yes.
I feel like your story reminds me of that you had that Little Miss Sunshine moment.
Oh yeah, that's right. I totally forgot about that scene. Yeah.
um, so how we discussed how color theory was definitely an issue, but how has your disability impacted your design?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I feel like I almost want to say in some ways it hasn't. It's just different paths to solving the problem,
Hmm.
right? And I think for me, because I'm colorblind doesn't mean I can't comprehend color theory, right? I still understand primary, secondary colors and really approaching like what color choices like make good design. It just is a little bit of a challenge, or it's something in a more written way in that regard. And one way I've really coped with it and found different pathways is I remember when I was doing a lot of front end web development, I would memorize a lot of these hex codes of like colors as opposed to remembering the visual color themselves. So I would know what hex codes like work well together in that regard. And I think that was something where starting to explore design on the web was really interesting because it was like a written output as well too for me to be able to comprehend some of these things better. So for me, I like to think like it hasn't had an impact, but it's a different pathway. And I think that's the thing about uh, having disabilities and designing or just doing anything in your work is you need to present different pathways for people to be successful and uh, in order to do that. And the same with kind of what I described with some of the learning challenges I've had, or being able to make visual connections, like those are really important for me. So being able to have those venues where you can be best set up for success in
Hmm.
that regard has been really important. And fortunately, I've been at places where, at least from my perspective, I felt really supported in learning and coping with my disabilities. And this unfortunately not true in every place for people, but I think that's the important thing is like the different ways of achieving a certain goal and outcome for both cases that I struggle with is so important.
Yeah, I really like that. In what ways have you felt supported, and in what ways do you support others?
Yeah, I remember one of my managers, she just had this really empathetic moment where I remember in a leadership meeting, we had this Google spreadsheet of just project status of how we're doing on certain product development initiatives for the quarter. And I remember she had this moment when she could tell I was like really like squinting my eyes or really struggling with following along. And what we had was we had these colored circles
Hmm.
of project status. We used red, yellow, green, if you can imagine.
Yep.
And I think you know where I'm going with this. It's like I could not tell if we were just crushing it and we were just ahead on our goals, or if we were severely behind in everything.
Yeah.
There was maybe one or two yellow projects, right, in that regard. But it's something like, at a stoplight, you can tell there's other visual indicators to do that.
Hmm.
And I remember after that meeting, I told her about my disability, and the next meeting we had, and we added different shape indicators too.
Great.
So like the green was a play button, and being able to distinguish that. And I think it takes people to really be mindful of like how it affects people, and being able to make those tiny changes in that regard, I think goes a really long way. As we think about accessibility, there's always this temptation to try to solve it overnight, and there's a lot to do. So I really commend that, but I think a lot of it is kind of building in those habits and recognizing like those like micro challenges that people endure. So that's one example of someone really supporting me in my career, just even seeing like, okay, like that was the first time at a leadership position I felt my color blindness be an impact. And it's so small. It's just like, but the impact was huge because it's like I can't participate in this conversation because I guess I could ask people tell me what colors like certain
Yeah.
statuses are, but it's just a different conversation. But even a small thing like that made a significant difference.
Hmm. That's great. And I think it's a good segue to my next question too. Um, as you mentor new designers and whatnot, what are ways in which they can be more accessible? And what are things that you wish they would build into their practices more often?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because with design systems, it's a big emphasis of something for people to learn. And I say we as a design practice, generalizing, not like specific people, but I think we often miss, teaching ARIA and teaching some of the other basic foundations of accessibility that goes with great like web design, mobile design. And it seems to be such a huge opportunity within design systems to teach that and talk about that and that scalability. And it just feels sometimes like we miss out on being to cover that. And I don't know if it's something where it's lack of time, lack of knowledge, or some other factors in that regard. But I think that's something accessibility can really play into, is teach it as a foundation of design, as a part of that. And I think there's a lot I still need to learn about accessibility. However, I do think one thing that helped me is W3 schools, like really learning about like constructing on the web and really learning about that role of accessibility. Previous lifetime, I did a lot of work on iOS platforms, and I think Apple's done a tremendous job with accessibility and how they build things out. So I think, yeah, just really treating it as a foundational element versus something added on after the fact. And that starts with teaching designers on that as a foundational skill.
I couldn't agree more. And if there was one thing that you would have designers change tomorrow, what would you recommend?
That's a good question. There's so many things, huh? Let me think. So if there's one thing I could change. I think I say this a lot, in what I mean by this saying. So the saying I express to people is think about systems design before design systems. And I think it's really understanding at the macro level, the systems that have in play in human behavior, how they interact with design, whether it's software or hardware. My background software, so I'll kind of speak at that, but really kind of understand like some of those foundational implications and elements before getting too rushed into some of the decorative parts of design. And trust me, like I do feel the decorative parts is really important as well, but just really honing in on the system design of that aspect. And I think you'll see, because if you do that, it's like it's clear how DEI, inclusion, and accessibility play into what we do as designers at that macro level, even before we're even thinking about what the software is in that regard.
Okay. Is there something that employers can do to be more inclusive?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different things. I would say it's interesting because there's a lot of conversations around remote work and returning to the office. And one thing I don't hear people talk a lot about is the benefits that remote work has for disabled people and how that really helps and benefits, like not having to commute or not, depending on your disability, right? There's a lot of benefits that remote work can enable. So that's one, whether you're going back to the office or having a hybrid model. I think remote accommodations and really thinking about what accommodations people need is super important. I think continued education too. One of the things we do at Webflow is there's a lot, we have guest speakers come in and really talk about accessibility and talk about inclusion. We're exploring content around just learning more about ableism and what that means, and really like exploring the other sides of that. Like we have a really great head of DEI who Mariah, who spearheads a lot of this, and I think a lot of it's just continued education. I think the thing that's important is that is continued learning, and it's very easy to shame people or feel ashamed about the lack of progress that has been made on accessibility, and the people who are disabled like feel that the most. So I think the one thing employers can do and also employees can do for disabled team members is to 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 not put the burden on disabled people to educate and teach these things, because they've spent their entire lives um, having to do this, and it's I can only empathize that it's like exhausting. You know,
Mm.
for me, I think you know, and each disability has different impacts and accommodations in that regard. You know, so color blindness is very different than another disability someone else might have. So really understanding like what those use cases are. I think those are some ways to support from an employer perspective.
This has been really wonderful, and I really appreciate your time. Is there any last parting thoughts that you'd like to include?
Um, Let me think. No, just thank you so much for doing this. I think it's important. I think, you know, one thing I realized is when I started being more open about my disability and other challenges I have,
Mhm.
I realize so many other designers go through similar things too. And it's nice to know. I feel being just having a disability has made me more thoughtful in some aspects of design, right? Like, and again, because I'm colorblind, it makes me think about what other disabilities other people might have. It's not like I'm just optimizing for color blindness, but even just knowing that this is one of many disabilities at various levels of severity, uh, that what people go through that. So it just becomes more empathetic. So I think just, I guess parting words is encouraging designers to, if you are comfortable talking about it openly, because you don't know how that might affirm someone uh, going through similar challenges, and how inspiring and motivating that might be for people.
I really love that, and I think that's a great way to end. Thank
Awesome.
you so much.
Thank you for having me.